One of the things I want to talk about with a story like Rip Van Winkle is how it uses this simple and relatively quaint idea of a character falling asleep, and specifically falling asleep while history happens. Irving uses this rather quaint conceit as a way of speaking to the importance at times of fantasy when engaging with revolutionary politics. Rip Van Winkle also engages notions of work, what work can look like, and what work should look like. In addition, I want to spend a bit of time talking about how Irving suggests, even in a counterintuitive way, what freedom may look like. I want to develop this idea that under the rule of a monarch, one might be more free than otherwise. And that's something of a provocative idea, I know, but it is an idea worth considering when thinking about this story. But the final thing worth thinking about, because this is an American literature course, is how history and mythology seem to work in tandem with one another to create or construct this understanding of what is true and what is real. I think where I want to begin is just with the opening paragraph, and I'll say something about this narrator, this Diedrich Knickerbocker, this fictional narrator that Irving constructs for the story a bit later. But if you look at the opening paragraph, and this begins on page 1004 in your book, I would encourage you to pay attention to how many times the word change appears in this opening paragraph. And I'm reading directly from the opening paragraph here. Whoever has made a voyage up the Hudson must remember the Catskill Mountains. They are a branch of the great Appalachian family, and are seen away to the west of the river, swelling up to a noble height and lording over the surrounding country. Every change of season, every change of weather, indeed, every hour of the day produces some change in the magical hues and shapes of these mountains, and they are regarded by all the good wise, far and near, as perfect barometers. When the weather is fair and settled, they are clothed in blue and purple and print their bold outlines on the clear evening sky. But sometimes, when the rest of the landscape is cloudless, they will gather a hood of gray vapors about their summits, which, in the last rays of the setting sun, will glow and light up like a crown of glory. So, again, notice here how often Irving uses this word change. So, Irving is not being coy here. He's actually just telling us that this is a story about change. Again, just notice 3 times the word change appears at the beginning of the story. But I would also want to bring to your attention how important these mountains are. These Catskill Mountains seem to be a space of fantastical and mythological significance. And what you might notice as you read the story is that for a character like Rip, the freedom he finds in these mountains, it's certainly a retreat from a kind of domestic horror. And I think you could certainly accuse this story of being a bit misogynistic, because they are conditions that Rip has created in many ways for himself. But the point, I suppose, is that by retreating into the mountains, Rip perhaps retreats into a fantasy and even a fantastical space, a mythological space. And this is a space that is very much meant to reflect, perhaps, the United States, or America before it became the United States. Again, think back to a figure like Thomas Jefferson and some of the things he said about some of the bits of landscape in Virginia. He seems to write about it in a similar way. There's almost something mythological and fantastical about it. So you can see Irving pivoting, perhaps, from some of those ideas in really compelling ways. Now, it's worth talking about a figure like Rip Van Winkle because he is certainly an odd choice for a protagonist. If you're someone, for example, who likes Lord of the Rings, you might find certain similarities. Even though that's, of course, English literature, you might find certain similarities between the hobbits in the Shire and a figure like Rip. He, for example, does not seem to enjoy working that much. But what's interesting about Rip, and Irving is quite clear about this, he's not someone who won't work. He just doesn't seem to like the idea of working as an obligation. He volunteers his time and his labor, which might afford us an opportunity to think about what someone like Irving thinks about labor, and in particular, the sorts of commodified forms of labor that was becoming quite prevalent during this time. And the way that we even think about labor today, again, very few, if any of us, work because we want to. We work as a necessity. And it seems as if for a figure like Rip Van Winkle, he enjoys the idea of working, but only when it's on a voluntary basis. He seems to despise the idea of working as a necessity. So, if you're interested in notions of labor, I would encourage you to think a little more about what this story might say about labor, both voluntary labor and required labor. But we also learn that Rip is someone who does not seem terribly engaged politically. He's socially engaged. He enjoys gossip. He really enjoys trading and trafficking in the gossip of this sleepy community before his long sleep. But near the end of the story, Irving, again, he brings this to our attention in a rather unambiguous and clear way. This is on page 1014, and this is what he writes. Rip now resumed his old walks and habits, and remember, this is after he has awoken from his sleep or his slumber. Rip now resumed his old walks and habits. He soon found many of his former cronies, though all rather the worse for the wear and tear of time, and preferred making friends among the rising generation, with whom he soon grew into great favor. And then a bit farther down the page, Rip, in fact, was no politician. The changes of state and empire made little impression upon him. So, two things. First, notice how endlessly adaptable Rip seems. He's someone who would not discriminate based on political allegiance or affiliation. He's just so endlessly adaptable, and you could argue he's so adaptable because there's something quite shallow about him. Now, that's not to suggest that Rip is a superficial character, because I don't think he is. Irving uses him in remarkably significant ways, but because he doesn't seem to be someone who's wedded to a set of ideological principles, again, he's quite malleable. And I would certainly encourage you to consider and think about what this might mean, that Rip is someone who, as nations change, as kings become presidents, it's just all so inconsequential to Rip. And there are times when this is a remarkably funny story. Notice how, for a character like Rip, he simply exchanges one George for another, and it's all meaningless to him. It doesn't mean a damn thing to him. So it seems for a character like Rip Van Winkle, and again, I'm not sure how far I would want to take this, but you could certainly come to the conclusion that for someone like Irving, political engagement, particularly political engagement in a representative democracy, it's actually not as freeing and liberating as we might think. And I would challenge you to think about this as much as you want, but you could come to this conclusion that life under a monarchy, it actually affords one more freedom than life in a representative democracy because of what's required of you, what's required of a citizen in a representative democracy, at least for that democracy to work the way it should. Now, again, to be clear, I'm not trying to suggest that this is what I think, but it is something that Irving wants to dramatize and attempt to understand better, because I would encourage you to pay close attention to what this town looks like, both before and after Rip's 20-year sleep. Prior to his 20-year slumber, this is a slow, sleepy town. Very little seems to happen. Rip can just sit at this inn all day and just talk and gossip with his friends. But after, there seems to be more activity. Things are moving. The inn becomes a hotel, and perhaps you might think, well, what's the significance in changing the way we understand this space? What's the difference between an inn and a hotel? Maybe there's this commerce element at play, but there does seem to be just more. There's more happening. There's more once Rip returns, and I don't know how far I would want to take this critique of the new and the novel, because that's how many people read the story. They suggest that Rip Van Winkle is a story that offers a critique of this new generation that Rip discovers in his old home. I would encourage you to simply do with these ideas whatever you would like. But I certainly do think the story tries to understand, or at least ask a series of questions about what it might mean to live under the rule of a monarch and what it might mean to live in a representative democracy. What's asked of you within each system, and especially when thinking about ideas like freedom, when and under what conditions are we more and most free? If we're trying to achieve the greatest amount of freedom, are we most free in a representative democracy, or are we most free when there's this omnipotent monarch? It's a question the story seems to want to explore and understand as thoroughly as possible. So, it's perhaps worth considering the way the story thinks about mythology, history, and truth, because you would not be incorrect to think, as you were reading this, that Rip Van Winkle feels a bit like a fairy tale. And it certainly does. It has those sorts of elements. There are spooky mountains, there are ghosts, and we're told at one point by, I believe, the son of a historian that yes, these ghosts are absolutely real. And all of that perhaps challenges us to think about what is the process of history making and what does that process actually look like? Because I think often what we like to assume and we want to assume is that history is the truth with a big capital T. However, I think what Irving possibly encourages us to think is that history, in many ways, is this odd marriage or confluence of mythology, superstition, fantasy, and fact. It all gets bundled together. And for those of us left to think about the past and think about history, all of that is flattened in some way. But Irving is certainly attempting, at least I would argue, to bring to our attention what the production of history actually looks like, and how there is a lot of mythology and there is a lot of fantasy connected to, and it functions as a kind of supplement to what actually happens in some ways. We're left at the end with something far more complicated and far more muddled than we would perhaps want it to be. And that is certainly a fascinating way that the story uses fiction as a means of critiquing and maybe even understanding better than nonfiction ever could history and what the production of history ultimately looks like. Now, it is also worth, perhaps, discussing what we are ultimately meant to think about a figure like Rip. And again, this is the sort of thing that you see quite often in fantasy and fairy tales. A male protagonist figure who, in many ways, at least I would argue, the narrator wants us to think is compelled into action by a kind of domestic disruption. He's someone who, if we wanted to use perhaps a bit of insensitive language, he's a bit henpecked. What's interesting about this, I would argue, for those of us reading it in 2020, is to consider, well, how does Irving perhaps understand Rip as a character? Because it's certainly not fair to say that someone like Rip is infallible, because he's certainly not. He leaves his family to suffer because of his inability or unwillingness to work for profit. We actually see that. We see the culmination of that once Rip awakens, and we see what his son has become. And his son, he's in many ways just inherited so many of the flaws that defined his father. But Irving, he seems to offer something of a celebration of this kind of character. And it's worth asking, well, what is he celebrating with a figure like Rip Van Winkle? Because Rip Van Winkle is a decidedly contradictory figure. He embodies a lot of the ideas that many of us would perhaps describe as distinctly American. He seems to enjoy his freedom. He doesn't like the idea that someone would force him to do something he would otherwise not want to do. He seems to enjoy solitude and retreating into the mountains. You know, again, these distinctly American ideas. Yet, he also, and again, this is part of where you see the contradiction, he's distinctly un-American. We are a rather industrious country. We value perhaps to our detriment work, and Rip is certainly not someone, well, again, I think it's perhaps unfair to come to the conclusion that Rip is someone who doesn't like to work, because he does seem to enjoy working when he has the option to volunteer to do so. But more than anything, Rip seems to be the sort of character who would like nothing more than to spend his days just talking to his friends and gossiping endlessly. In that way, Rip is not someone defined by this capitalist drive toward accumulation, which I would argue that's precisely what we see once Rip awakens in his home. This new but old place for him. This old new place for him. It's very much defined by this capitalist drive toward accumulation. And that is not Rip Van Winkle under any circumstances. If you're interested in these sorts of contradictions that Rip might embody, that's one way to think about it. He functions symbolically. He symbolizes many distinctly American ideas while also not embodying many of those ideas. In fact, embodying the complete opposite or the complete antithesis of so many of those ideas.